Hi guys, nice to see you all. I'm going to do a reading from my book Narrative Architecture today because Alicia Pivaro has asked me to talk about NATO, and I thought the NATO group would be best explained by the chapter in the book on the subject. So I'm going to read to you about 2/3 of chapter 3, which is about NATO. Ready? Returning to London in 1981 from a year in New York, I became obsessed by a newly expressionistic art that was being shown in prominent Soho galleries. Artists like Julian Schnabel, Francesco Clemente, and Sandro Chia had finally pushed aside arte povera in favour of what came to be known as the trans-avant-garde. The term narrative painting had also surfaced in relation to various artists that were part of gallerist Holly Solomon's retinue, including Judy Pfaff and Isar Patkin. Solomon wanted to distinguish her artist's work from the dry conceptualism and performance that dominated other Manhattan art venues like the Kitchen and the latter-day formalism of the Leo Castelli Gallery on West Broadway. In London, I realised that as an architect I could throw out my rapidograph technical pen and paint architecture with a narrative derived from the life I was leading. In the 1980s, it was the degree of dysfunction and the prevalent decay that tipped the balance. Like all teachers feeling their way, I tentatively introduced my hunches to students at the AA in Diploma Unit 10, which I'd taken over from Bernard Tschumi in 1978. I thought, why not put the French philosophy to one side and try drawing more freely and being lavish with colour? A Bible at the time was a remaindered book, a tonic to the nation, about the 1951 Festival of Britain that we all found captivating in its crassness and optimism. For Britain at least, the festival was relatively unrestrained, with the story told by every structure blistering out into sculptures and graphics that matched the scale of the buildings. The book featured intriguing diagrams that traced a route past the features of the story in each pavilion. In the academic year 1981-82, the group of students in my unit was getting the hang of an anarchistic working method that mixed music, performance, and film culture. Short video performances were produced with the help of Ricardo Paes, a Portuguese theatre director. Strange props and outfits appeared in the surreal interpretations of everyday life that began the academic year. The overall theme was to be Giant-Sized Baby Town, a title appropriated from a Bow Wow Wow song produced by Malcolm McLaren. Our goal was to visualise a new independent state on the Isle of Dogs in London's Docklands, which under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's new government policy was earmarked as an enterprise zone with a loose approach to planning, though not, I suspect, as free as we imagined. The idea of the island state certainly inspired the students. It was as attractive as it was implausible. People would live and work in the same environments. It was not only our job to design it, but to fully communicate it and assert it as if it were a reality. In response to output of the project, Tschumi observed, architecture ceases to be a backdrop for actions becoming the action itself. The ultimate live-work world meant that people would literally live, sleep, eat and breathe in facilities built around, above and below the production line. New meanings were emerging anyway from British industry. Factories were becoming a thing of the past and were a legitimate condition for students to reinvent. We started to cross-reference storyboards, sectioned through large parts of the city and the production line. Montage, as classic situations were called in film theory, could be the result of an environmental assemblage that brings several modes of thinking together into one linear confusion that combines event, movement and space. With Tschumi, I had some experience in publishing with some small end-of-year books at the AA. The most significant amongst these was the catalogue accompanying an exhibition organised at the Royal College of Art in 1975 by curator Rosalie Goldberg, called A Space, 1,000 Words. In some 28 artists' and architects' artworks consisted of exactly that, an image and a text presented as a single work. It was good grounding perhaps for the more punk-oriented mood of the early 80s. If we had published then, it would have been close to some of the earlier Situationist publications from the 1960s. We were fulfilling Situationist International member Attila Kenyani's Call to Arms, a little handbook of appropriated, that is, détourné vocabulary should be developed. I am suggesting that sometimes, instead of reading neighbourhood, we read gangland, instead of social organisation, perfection, instead of society, racket, instead of culture, conditioning, instead of leisure, protected crime, instead of education, premeditation. The following year, the focus shifted to another part of London's docklands, Surrey Docks, on the south side of the Thames, around Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. Thatcher's cavalier politics had encouraged me to think up ironic forms of imperial power as captured by the Falklands War. The war dominated the media from its beginning on the 2nd of April 1982 until long after it was over by mid-June. The first project I set for the new group was a museum of the Falklands War. I wanted to do the project at the same time as everyone else. It would encourage a paint-in and lots of work done very fast. The site was an ancient flight of outdoor stairs down to the river's edge called Globe Stairs. Despite their modest scale in relation to the size of London, they captured the absurdity of a war over a small group of islands off the coast of Argentina. Mark Prizeman did some enormous drawings of converted battleships moored at an inlet in the Thames. In my version of the project, HMS Albion, one of Her Majesty's returning warships, would be converted to house a permanent reenactment of the destruction of the Argentine warship, the General Belgrano. A stair of flames would lead up to an exhibition capsule from which a sculpture of a sacrificed sailor would hover above the building. All technical description in the drawing had given way to an expressionistic capturing of the moment and the effect on the viewer. To build such a thing, you would need to work backwards from the drawings. The experiment was followed by the customary mini-projects of constructed object, performance and video, and eventually the group began to look at the larger area of Surrey Docks. This time I wanted them to mix up art and science and explore the effects on these worn-out and run-down parts of London. The word anarchy was rarely used, but there was an anything-goes spirit behind much of the work. We competed to see who could come up with the most bizarre scenarios, yet somehow they were all related to the city as we found it. It appeared to be an aspiration for the younger generation of society that we should live fearlessly and that the city return to a primal state without any imperial delusions. Power should be in the hands of the people, and indeed it was if you had a video camera. That year, much of the work fizzed with the attitude of the people we imagined would inhabit our projects. It was a premonition of the cultural buzz that would begin to take shape 10 years later in Hoxton, just north of central London. But to the critics of the time, its lifestyle scenario building was dangerously remote from the conventions of architectural design. Plans and sections had mostly disappeared in favour of a lurid form of illustration that accompanied the elaborate stories which manifested the workings of each particular part of the city under the scrutiny of each student. Although it wasn't formally narrative in the sense that there were plots and storylines with a beginning and an end, the work was certainly as narrative as the work of Holly Solomon's artists. The work was full of imaginary content, character, and portraiture of the people who would live in it, It was about burgeoning, misbehaving and occasional criminal society that, in our view, was closer to the reality of London than were the families with children clutching balloons that appeared in most artists' impressions of the mediocre buildings that were actually getting built. Some very strong projects emerged, including Christina Norton's Marriage Line, Robert Mull's Parliament, Simon Helster's Resort, and Mark Priseman's Wolf Housing. Each of them evolved a lifestyle premise and applied it as literally and as assertively as possible to a sectional slice taken more or less arbitrarily through the city fabric. We were all convinced by the collective reality of our project, and negotiating the edges between its constituent parts done by different authors. Discovered that conflicts could be turned to advantage. Similarly, the decrepit shadows of the area's former glory found their way into much of the work. Existing sheds or tower blocks were readily retained and given a punky layering to the outcome. For instance, Mark Priseman converted a tower block of police flats into a new housing project that included some of the East End's more borderline entertainments like dog racing and handbag snatching. Every one of Priseman's drawings has an air of illicit complicity about it. Alongside the ordinary folk, shady characters inhabit his world, second-hand car dealers, prostitutes. In his wolf housing, one group of towers had a park that bridged between them at roof level. There's no rooftop landscape. This is no rooftop landscape such as Le Corbusier's much mimicked Unité d'habitation Marseille, but the reign of wolves that live happily but separately from the intense urban condos beneath them. In a typically obverse-perverse combination of Priseman's, the presence of the wolves adds to the architectural and social attraction of the apartments below. No wonder then that Diploma Unit 10's work that year turned out to be more of a challenge than for the external examiners, architects James Stirling and Ed Jones were used to. Although silently viewing the work during the assessment procedure, it was not until the tutors and examiners gathered at the end of the day that they announced that to them the work was unassessable. As far as they could see, it was not architecture. What was to be done? In the end, it was agreed that an alternative panel would look at the work, and thus the work was duly passed, but not without repercussions. A couple of days later, Building Design had a controversy as its cover scoop, AA Students in Design row. Alvin Boyarsky, the head of the school, wanted us to prove that our skins had been worth saving, so he offered us the opportunity of publishing. He had a book in mind, but we soon decided that a magazine would be a more vital format, reaching more people more quickly. The magazine needed a title, and perhaps so did we as a group, so I suggested to those gathered for our first meeting that both should be called NATO, Narrative Architecture Today. It captured the artistic mood of the time and appropriated the treaty alliance for our own purposes. Innocent enough, the name served us well, and although relatively short-lived, it led to 3 issues of the magazine and a host of projects, interjects and exhibitions over the following 3-year period. NATO 1 appeared in the spring of 1984. As Rick Poyner said, collectively of NATO, its districts, overlaid functions and meshed together narratives in a provocative flux designed to cause meanings to slip and reverse. The group and the magazine provided a robust context in which, like the Surrealists and their magazines, the imaginary could be treated as a reality. At the time, there was precious little opportunity for architects to build. It is no exaggeration to say that the architectural scene was centred on work produced by the schools and by architects who were practising with their lifestyle rather than their designs. Apart from Cedric Price and Stirling himself, the commercial world of the prominent British firms of Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Ahrens, Burton and Korolek and Nicholas Grimshaw seemed to us remote and irrelevant to the future of the city. We wanted to harness the turbulence that the huge social changes of the time were causing. Our friends lived in squats and warehouses with beds inside greenhouses and shacked up on top of milk crates. People from all creative fields, particularly from the St. Martin's School of Art and the Royal College of Art, were taking to each other and swapping ideas. NATO people were not interested in artists, fashion folk and designers NATO people were more interested in artists, fashion folk and designers than in other architects, as the pages of NATO magazine show. It was time to grasp the city as a whole, along with everyone and everything in it, and the more chaotic the better. British architect Ralph Tubbs' observation from the war years, the crazy silhouettes of twisted steel, could be a slogan for the new post-war age that had come to pass years later. A new war was being fought, breaking down the old hierarchies that even the liberated 1960s had not touched, and doing so by example as well as by design. Thatcher delivered a fatal handbagging to the Greater London Council, whose relentless crossfire from County Hall towards the House of Parliament had been an irritant to government. In 1984, I was invited by Boyarsky to make a solo show at the AA, and I decided on a project around the newly vacant County Hall as the site for a new exhibition of architecture that would stretch along the south bank of the river from St Thomas's Hospital to the Festival Hall, the only remaining part of the 1951 Festival of Britain. The project took each of the principal sectors in this area of the South Bank and reworked them into an invading, flowing, marauding public territory that had the atmosphere of a building site, with its cranes, platforms and plastic bin chutes. It suggested both architecture and a society in a fervent state of flux. The resulting installation combined a variety of communication techniques, from a huge grungy model that spread out from the fireplace in the gallery to a colonnade of wiry stands on which hung a photographic storyboard of a TV newscast, in photos speaking from various locations soon to be transformed when the project goes ahead. A set of 6 oil pastel drawings focused on each of the main conditions in the project, and a huge panelling painting of the whole assemblage seen from the air occupied an entire wall. Each one of the drawings in the set of 6 was a study of how existing buildings could be blown open and could make way for an influx of new roads, paths and people. The hermetic character of County Hall would, in my version, be subjected to the traffic flow that swirls around Waterloo Station. Dynamic business streets would invade St Thomas's Hospital, County Hall and every building across the area. It would assume an exhibition-like upscaling of reality by incorporating superhuman sculptures. By 1984, the giant as a motif had appeared in various forms in NATO work. The first issue of the magazine featured Ark Albion, the name given to the revisioning of the south bank of Bermondsey. The Roman giant Albion seemed an apt evocation of the New Britain, and since there are still numerous Albion streets in the capital and countless more pubs by the same name, it was an idea that had resonance for many local people. Ark Albion had a Noah's Ark too, a lifeboat that was a metaphor for the life-saving work of St Thomas's. Its slipway emerged from the hospital buildings and met the river surface, and amid a line of 6 giant fishtails, effectively they made the river part of the exhibition. As it appeared in NATO 2, the Apprentice issue, Ark Albion captured a vision of the city as an endless building site. Every construction in it was subject to a functional reinterpretation. Conventional features of architecture such as the tower, the curtain wall and the pilotis gave way to signs of change, to scaffolding, tarpaulins and provisional contraptions of all kinds. The plastic bin chute was of particular iconic importance. A fringe of them dangled like elephants' trunks from the facade of County Hall, and being as large as the columns they sprang out between, at least equalled the iconography of what had originally been built in Portland stone. The NATO group was acquiring the persona of a rock band and appeared in youth and lifestyle magazines, including L'Uomo Vogue in Italy and Brutus in Japan. Magazines beget magazines, and one of our goals had come to be. It was possible to make a connection between the street style that was driving much of British youth culture, rather than being confined to a discourse among architects. We managed to reach our target audience, people with a fashion, music or club sensibility. The assumption that realised buildings could be the mainstay of architectural publishing was being called into question. A degree of professional recognition was not that long in coming. The same year, the Star Choice exhibition of the RIBA in Portland Place set out to bring several architects and designers together in a collaborative design venture. The star we chose was Derek Jarman, who by that time had become one of our favourite critics at the Architectural Association. He had a background in architectural history from his studies at King's College London, and despite his subsequent punk leanings towards radical clashes and vital instinct, he had a penchant for historical whirls and twirls. From a series of face-to-face encounters with Jarman, his dream house emerged from a transformed derelict building on the edge of a quarry on the Dorset coast, above Dancing Ledge, a place that he had immortalised as the title of his first book. There was talk of a pet goat that would be tethered at the centre of the quarry, and the house itself would occupy the old stone structure midway between the quarry and the high cliff that plunges into the ocean. Despite the modesty of this structure, originally an engine room, the cross walls defined a series of spaces that could easily be assigned personable domestic functions. The largest of these would be an open-plan room with a kitchen and a sitting room, and the narrowest would become Jarman's library. Books would occupy a circular bookcase standing free from the structure and topped with a pineapple dome that would spout from the roof. From the outside, conventional walls would only exist in the form of the original structure. In turn, these were exaggerated with giant scrolls set at incongruous angles suggesting the presence of buried classical ruins. Sections of roof between these walls stretched down to the ground like giant tongues and would be covered in grass as if to hide the whole house and avoid attention from visitors to the well-known beauty spot. Inside, too, the contrast between the overscale and singular modesty continued. A series of colossal legs acted as columns to support a mezzanine walkway that in turn would lead to a narrow tunnel cutting through the rock and emerging as a private balcony looking out to sea. Lessons here were many. This was a true collaboration, not only with Jarman, but most members of the group. It was a modest proposition that contrasted with the hyper-urban scale of most of our previous work, and yet, like the urban projects, it contained a potent theatricality that would be revealed over time. The whole NATO project reached an apotheosis with Gamma City, an exhibition first hosted in 1985 at Ivona Blaswick's brief but important air gallery in Rosebery Avenue, London. Subsequently, it travelled to the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, Massachusetts. Issue 3 of the magazine doubled up as the catalogue of the exhibition and the Gamma City issue. It proclaimed the deeply penetrating effect of gamma rays emanating from our architectural interventions. They would be transmitters of NATO dynamism towards the rest of the city. A simple phenomenological urban lexicon differentiated the two floors of the air gallery. Downstairs characterised the city as the marketplace, while upstairs was the boudoir. The show's ad hoc spirit was announced predictably enough by a scaffolding addition to the building and yellow plastic bin chutes poking from specially acquired tarpaulin sheets. Inside, a model swooped upwards as if to pass through the ceiling to the upper gallery, reinforcing the point that every activity of the city should reach into others, as well as collecting some of the more iconic projects that had been done over previous years. The new ones appeared like Carlos Villanueva brand's bathing buildings, sited in the Peabody buildings across from the gallery. Katrina Beaver designed an office based on a garden, and Robert Mull made a table so tall you could walk underneath it. My own wombat wardrobe imported the vocabulary of the building site into the bedroom as a wardrobe made from scaffolding and tarpaulins. Models and furniture were an important addition to the architectural show. There had been some furniture pieces made for the controversial AA unit show in 1983, including 2 tables made from recycled car bonnets, but in Gamma City, objects played a much more fundamental role. 3 collage double-page spreads in NATO 3 combined its slogan, manifesto, object and project. Gamma City crossed an invisible boundary that differentiated architecture from art. Without actually building the designs at full scale, both magazine and exhibition brought the viewer into its own spatial framework. At the Air Gallery, we wanted a ricochet effect to fire between the drawings, the real scale objects and the actual and metaphoric scale of the gallery. As objects and drawings bridged between disparate but otherwise conventional fields, ambiguity was rife. Together, the 2 floors of the show combined into one huge 3-dimensional drawing of the entire city. Likewise, the magazine had stepped outside the conventions of the architectural project and portrayed the reader as well as the building. And that's the end of my reading. I hope you enjoyed it. Good night.